So agenda for this presentation, I'm going to walk through the basics of stewardship contracting, and apologies for folks that just participated in the Easter meeting. The first bit of this presentation is going to be a bit of a rehash. We're going to talk about the case study methodology that we use to look at 20 stewardship contracting projects across the country. We're really going to focus a lot on these themes, sort of cross-cutting themes that we observed across stewardship contracting projects, and hopefully have some time for open discussion. So when I think about stewardship contracting, it's a bundle of authorities that are afforded to the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management to conduct land management activities, whether that's timber-related activities or any variety of natural resource management projects on federal public land. And sounds like people are having a hard time hearing me. So I'm going to try to speak up a little bit. But really, so there's a collection of authorities, best value contracting, which allows the agency to select contractors based on other factors other than just the bid. So this would be their prior experience, whether it's a local business, if there's any number of other values associated with their bid package. Multi-year contracting, stewardship contracting can go up to 10 years in length, which is really sort of a unique feature of stewardship authorities. Designation by prescription and description allow a lot of flexibility in terms of how projects are out. They provide a lot of flexibility to the operator in terms of how they conduct their work and how the end result, the desired end result, is achieved. So really focusing on efficiency. Another unique aspect, contracts can be awarded or sourced on a sole source basis, and there's a sole source justification, but this is I'd say a less oftenly used authority under stewardship. But there's a few instances that we looked at actually this past year where it was used. There's one with a tribe in the Ottawa National Forest, for instance, in the Lake States. Trading goods for services and retained receipts are, I think, really sort of the main features of stewardship contracting that people often think of. It's instead of a timber sale, the concept is there's a marketable good that is basically traded in exchange for services performed by a contractor or a stewardship agreement holder. And these services could be anything from road maintenance, culverts, habitat improvement, basically anything that is not timber-related, commodity-related work. So it allows the agencies to package projects in unique ways. Retained receipts allows the agencies to basically bank the receipts from timber or other goods sold in a stewardship project and use that money on the forest to pay for additional restoration or natural resource management activities. So a pretty popular tool with many of the projects that we looked at this past year. And we also see with stewardship contracting a widening of the type of operators that are working on the federal lands. So we've got nonprofits involved with a lot of stewardship agreements. Local governments are involved in some cases. And one of the projects that we looked at this year in particular, the North Park project in Colorado, there's a local government directly involved in it. So basically, to sum up, stewardship contracting is a pretty diverse tool. A lot of fun. For the past 10 years, there's been a window of time where stewardship authorities have been semi-permanent, I guess you could call it. In the 2014 Farm Bill, the Congress afforded the Forest Service and BLM permanent authorization. Under the 10-year authorization, the Pinchot Institute and a number of partners looked at carried out a programmatic monitoring framework that involved a survey that was administered to hundreds of people across the country. It had 18 questions, and we also did a series of in-person meetings, regional meetings, where we gathered more feedback. The process has been modified and pared down in part because we pretty much learned a lot from that 10-year authorization and those surveys, and the agencies were more interested in different questions that they felt would be important for them to look at and actually improve training as stewardship contracting continues to grow under the permanent authorization. So this is where we came in with a case study methodology to look at specific projects and instances related to some monitoring questions that the agencies wanted us to look at. And those questions, I'm just going to read them off here. So how are non-agency stakeholders, including local communities and tribes, engaging in stewardship projects, and both from the development phase on through the contracting phase? Has the way that non-agency stakeholders interacts with the Forest Service and BLM changed as a result of their participation in one or many stewardship contracting projects? Or conversely, has the way that the Forest Service and BLM interacts with non-agency stakeholders changed as a result of implementing one or more stewardship contracting projects? So really trying to get at whether or not the use of stewardship contracting as a contracting tool facilitates changes in relationships between the agency and non-agency partners. The third question, are local non-agency stakeholders as involved in stewardship projects as they would like to be? If not, what aspects of stewardship contracting would non-agency stakeholders, particularly tribes and local communities, like to be more involved in? So again, if you guys can think of, if you're a non-agency stakeholder and you have particular areas in which you want to get more involved, please enter those into the chat pod during the Q&A period of this meeting. Are there differences between projects in place with established collaborative groups and places that don't have established collaborative groups? So that was the other big question that we looked at. And is involvement of non-agency stakeholders, including local communities and tribes, influencing the scope and scale of projects? So are projects getting bigger? Are they getting more complex based on who's participating in them? Getting into the methods, we looked at 15 Forest Service projects across the country, 3 in each stewardship monitoring region. So in the West, we looked at 3 projects in the Northern Rockies region, 3 projects along the Pacific Coast, and 3 projects in the Southwest. And that's the Forest Service. And then we looked at 5 projects in the West with the BLM. We selected projects based on, we tried to focus mainly on projects that have been active in the last 3 years. In many cases, these projects go back a decade or more in terms of development. Really sort of diverse timeline and lifespan for a lot of these projects that we looked at. But that they were contracted in the last 3 years, that's basically the selection criteria we used. We wanted some broad distribution geographically, so multiple states, multiple forest resource and physiographic regions. We also wanted a balance of smaller projects and larger projects to get at that scale question. And also wanted to have a balance of stewardship agreements and stewardship contracts. And lastly, we specifically needed to try to understand changes or differences in these interactions between the agency and non-agency people within collaborative groups and then projects that didn't have collaborative groups. Alex, it looks like someone is asking about calling in, so if you could provide that information in the chat pod, that'd be very helpful. So as far as the sampling technique, we used a snowball sampling technique where we actually reached out to the main agency contact. They identified non-agency people that were involved in the project, and then we followed up with those individuals. And you can see the breakdown of how many interviews we did. We used a brief questionnaire to gather data related to those 5 monitoring questions, and then we verified that with multiple interviews in each project, and also where possible, project documentation that was available on the internet. In terms of the results, I'm going to talk about each of these projects. These are Forest Service projects in the region. You'll see we have a balance of a couple agreements, mostly contracts though, fairly good distribution of larger projects and smaller projects, and projects with collaborative groups, and projects in which respondents identified that there was no collaborative group present. You'll see the projects here. Just going to talk a little bit about them. So the Babillon project on the Bighorn National Forest in Wyoming. It's about 10,000 acres, and it's mainly a forest health and fuels reduction type project. The priorities were identified in a community wildfire protection plan. This project dates back 13 years, and it was actually originally timber sale. It was halved in terms of the acreage when the 2001 roadless rule came in. This project and our focus of the interviews was really about the relation between the Forest Service and a specific group of adjacent landowners that had some concerns related to the treatments. The Hardy project in the Black Hills National Forest, this was a fairly small project, mostly fuels, dealing with pine beetle issues. The project was actually appealed by an environmental group. There's been a series of appeals out there. It's a region where there's a fairly active timber market and a set of contract with timber sale projects. The South Fork Fish project, this was it's I'd say about a medium-sized project to a small project, 675 so acres. Packaged a lot of different priorities: timber harvest, road work, recreation, what one of the respondents termed to be rural wooby, and fuels reduction, and that's a series of homes out there. There's an active collaborative group present on the project. Respondents identified 7 membership organizations currently active on the project through that collaborative. Well, at the beginning of the project, they said that there's about 20 folks. So there's been this kind of ebb and flow in this particular project. The Escalante project in Colorado, this project is quite large. It has an active stewardship collaborative group with 7 organizations that were identified by respondents. Scoping started in 2012 and implementation began in 2013. And interestingly enough, this was one where interviewees suggested that the collaborative process actually resulted in the project getting bigger. Although one respondent from the timber industry did suggest that in general, projects end up getting smaller as non-agency stakeholders get involved. The East Mountain project, very, very interesting project on the Cibola National Forest down in New Mexico. 810 acres currently, but they have aspirations of getting up to 10,000 acres. It's a high-profile project with a lot of interesting ways in which it's being funded. It's a joint chiefs initiative with both the chief of NRCS and the chief of the Forest Service, and it's connected directly to the Nature Conservancy's Rio Grande Water Fund, so they're getting money to put into restoration work through that. Pretty fascinating stuff. It's a collaborative group project. There's 8 organizations that were identified as being involved, and also fairly unique, there's a lot of organizations that do work on the ground. This project actually was one that started on private lands through a community wildfire protection plan, and then the Forest Service was kind of a late comer to the party, but they really brought a lot of capacity and really codified some of the partnerships that were needed to move it forward in a big way. The Pinolino project. This was a project, interestingly enough, which if you look at all the information available on the internet, you could maybe assume that it had an active collaborative group with it, or several different collaborative processes going on related to science and market utilization of restoration materials. But when we actually asked the interviewees, they said, well, there's they didn't identify a specific collaborative group. So that's why it's marked as not having a collaborative group present. It's a large project, multiple objectives, complex landscape, and it's a multi-year project up to 10 years. It's also a stewardship agreement with National Wild Turkey Federation, who's working directly with the local Apache tribe, who's doing the cruising and timber layout. It's also doing skyline logging in the Southwest, which is a region where typically that is not a practice that's used. Shifting to the Pacific Northwest, you got the Jazz Plantation Thin. This is coming out of a very what some have called a very successful collaborative group that's done multiple stewardship contracting projects together. This is an instance where the collaborative group, however, ran into some challenges in terms of the relationships and the expectations, and the project entered into litigation. The Mill Creek A to Z project in the Colville National Forest in Washington, really fascinating example where they're doing some innovative, a very innovative approach, and that approach sort of found its footing in the collaborative process. It's a very large project, 54,000 acres over 10 years. There's 9 organizations involved, and the contract holder is actually involved. The reason why it's A to Z is because they're involved from the NEPA on through to implementation. So they're doing every phase of the project, contracted by the Forest Service. Definitely one to keep an eye on as it develops. The Hopper Corral project in California on the Plumas National Forest. This is one that really did not have a collaborative group involved with it. There was active collaborative groups in the area. The Quincy Library Group is there, but it ran into some challenges, and I would say that the respondents in the interviews described it as having a fairly high degree of distrust. So going forward, this is the data for all the projects nationwide. Most of the people that we talked to had only been involved in a few projects. I mentioned the Jazz project and the Colville project. They had several folks that were involved in 8 to 10 or up to 20 projects. So there's in some instances there's a lot of experience, and others there really is not a lot of experience. So you can kind of see that arc of collaborative development and innovation that's occurring in these projects. Typically, if you've got more experience and a more defined way in which people are working together between the agency and non-agency collaborators, they're attempting to do much more ambitious, cutting-edge kind of things. So by and large, most of the non-agency stakeholders considered themselves to be local. There was one exception, and most said that they were involved as they wanted to be. There's a couple people that said, I would love to be more involved if I had more time, and that was sort of a capacity issue that came up in a few different projects. For the BLM, the North Park project, it's a large stewardship agreement with doing restoration work with county government. The Powder House project is in the community of Sturgis, South Dakota, with fuels reduction work. It's a multiple landowner situation. Similarly, the Eastside Township is it's a contract built upon several different projects, stewardship projects with a small community in Idaho. The Huckleberry project, it's again it's actually a fairly large fuels project in Washington State in a very rural area. There's a mixed ownership landscape. There's some tribal land, um, up there. Again, another very, very interesting project. And then the Blitzen project in Oregon, large project, very large project, looking at pinyon juniper work, and the only project with the BLM that had a defined collaborative group associated with it. Most projects, most non-agency stakeholders, this was the first project that they involved in with the BLM. Most of them considered themselves to be local to the project, and most felt that they were as involved as they would like. So themes emerging across the projects. The first theme, just because a collaborative group is present doesn't mean it works. 5 of the 15 Forest Service projects across the country had collaboratives, and these were all in the West, and they were all large projects. So sort of an interesting finding. They also, had varying degrees of success, and this is success as we are defining it based on the ability of the collaborative group to come together on some agreement on natural resource management objectives and move into implementation and collaborative implementation. So the projects that, again, have the collaborative groups are listed here. And you may also consider that the Pinalino project had some collaborative elements associated with it and could very well be considered as having a collaborative group. We just didn't hear it directly stated in any of the interviews. One of the 5 BLM projects, the Blitzen project, had a collaborative group associated with it. This project was pretty interesting. It includes, it's a congressionally defined collaborative for the Steens Mountain Cooperative Management and Protection Area. All, I would say, a cross-section of stakeholders are included in this collaborative. There's a defined seat for each defined stakeholder category. However, one of the main environmental voices, who is continually described as a thorn in the side of the BLM, does not participate in that group, has not been allowed to. So they find other ways in which to influence projects, either indirectly through other participants, partners that they work with, or through continued appeals and litigation outside of the collaborative process. This group and this particular project has seen varying levels of success, largely tied to the leadership and participation by the agency. And this is a pretty interesting case study to read. So I would recommend when the report comes out that folks take a look at it. Again, this is with the Forest Service. South Fork, it's a large collaborative process, and the success and the commitment to the process seem to fluctuate over time. And this did coincide with a change in leadership within the Forest Service. Communication broke down when that happened, and some of the expectations that were lined out in the planning phase didn't carry over into implementation, and people felt like the trust that had built up and the agreement that was decided upon wasn't honored. This was also a project in which collaboration fatigue was identified by a number of folks that we interviewed. Collaborative dysfunction was evident in the Jazz Plantation Thin project. The collaborative group that surrounds this project is generally viewed as a very successful collaborative group. But in this project, that seemed to break down. There was one environmental group involved that had participated in, I believe it was between 8 and 10 projects with this group, but they dropped out of the group in protest because they did not agree with the actions that were that they felt were predetermined before they came to the collaborative table. The group has since rejoined the project, but this project has ended up in litigation. So just because you have a collaborative group doesn't mean it works, but sometimes it does. And we did have a few examples of it where we had some collaborative processes that were very successful. The East Mountain comes to mind. A lot of diversity in there. They used the collaborative group as a way to build capacity with a tribal group for implementation. And you'll see the quote here. it's really describing a collaborative group that is firing on all cylinders, and there's a lot of optimism in every interview that we conducted for this project. People were really, really excited about it. I would say that morale was high. The Escalante project, it's a large, high-profile project in Colorado. And again, the Forest Service person that we interviewed, one of them said this project, the engagement of non-agency stakeholders through the collaborative process definitely gives us some more buy-in and trust. So that was something that I think is really underpinning what they're trying to achieve, which is fairly ambitious in terms of accelerated restoration. So theme number 2, interactions with the agency vary widely across the case study projects. The number one thing that we heard as far as benefits that accrue from stewardship contracting authorities has always been, and continues to be, that it allows people to accomplish work on the ground. That said, there is no singular mode in which interaction between agency and non-agency stakeholders results in work being accomplished on the ground. Some instances, collaborative process leads to collaborative planning and identification of priorities and then implementation. In other instances, the process is, let's say, more efficient and involving less people, but maybe not having as broad a natural resource outcome because less objectives were entered into the project because less people were engaged early on. So a lot of different types of projects. So a few projects in the West that didn't have a collaborative group, such as the Hardy and Babillon project, the agency did a good job of engaging non-agency stakeholders. And these people most often were commenting on proposals. They were participating in some of the planning workshops, maybe some field tours, implementation monitoring, but this was not sort of happening in any fluid collaborative process. In other instances, it was fairly limited engagement, mainly through NEPA scoping. And that said, again, success as measured by the ability of a project to get done was not necessarily directly linked to having a collaborative process or not in the projects in the West. For the BLM, the BLM's land in many places is fairly parcelized, so interactions with individual landowners, much the same way that, say, an extension agent works with private landowners. That's a lot of what the BLM did in these projects. The Huckleberry project in Washington, the BLM did a really good job of communicating directly with the adjacent tribal land, as well as some landowners, private landowners, that they needed an easement to cross the land and get the work done. So concerns were addressed in these conversations, but no big collaborative effort was used. And still significant amount of hazardous fuel reduction and restoration forestry work was conducted on significant acreage. In the Powder House project, this is actually an instance where the BLM, because it's adjacent to a fairly sizable community, BLM representation participates in local meetings with local government pretty regularly, keeping them informed about the long-term plan for the project area. They also coordinate very seamlessly with the adjacent state lands to conduct controlled burns. And it was also an instance where community engagement actually led to the National Wild Turkey Federation getting involved, which brought in some more money and actually increased the scale and effectiveness of the project. Similarly, the Eastside Township was an example where the BLM invested in a local community-based NGO, and this group provided both technical support and really served as sort of a shuttle diplomacy between various interests in the project area. So that was sort of this. Again, change of agency staff during the life of a project represents challenges to collaboration. In some instances, it actually did provide some opportunities as well. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. And this is something that we've heard in our programmatic monitoring surveys throughout the 10-year authorization period. So East Mountain Project, Mill Creek A to Z, and the South Fork Project all had turnover within the agency during the life of the project. At least these were the projects in which this was identified as being an issue. But that doesn't mean that other projects didn't have this issue as well. In the instance of East Mountain, it was actually a good thing, which I'll get into. The Blitzen project, again, as I talked about before, that was a pretty deciding factor in the success of the collaborative process. In South Fork, there were some hard feelings over a particular unit, and it was an example where they did not follow the collaborative group's recommendations. And this was the perception from one of the collaborative participants. It's somewhere between the change in agency leadership on this project. A lot of the details was somewhat lost in translation. The East Mountain project, this was actually a case where a land officer came in, they saw what was happening with the private lands in the area, and I'll just read the quote. When I got here, our priority was to start to become more active with those partnerships, become a bigger player with landscape scale restoration and cross-jurisdictional emphasis, trying to tag onto all the great work that they had done, and become a more active partner at the table with those groups. And indeed, they were successful in doing so. Theme 4, perceived influences of non-agency stakeholder engagement on project scale sometimes depends on where a participant is standing. So this table includes all of the stewardship projects. You'll see the top projects that are shaded in yellow. Those are the Western U.S. Forest Service projects. Some of the projects were reported by respondents as actually increasing in scale. And this was the Escalante project, the East Mountain project, Mill Creek project. Some of them reported as getting smaller. So the South Fork fish, and the agency respondents specifically said you start off large, and these projects get pared way down. That was also the case in the Jazz projects, particularly to that specific project. The agency person that we talked to felt that the project had been, the scale had been changed, decreased. So and again, if you look at which projects had the collaborative groups, South Fork Fish, Escalante, East Mountain, Mill Creek, Jazz. So there's, some differences there in terms of the scale, but at least in 3 of them, people felt like the scale had increased based on the work of the collaborative group. So 3 out of 5 ain't bad. There's also changes in scope, so the complexity of the projects, the activities they were undertaking. There's actually a fair bit of projects in the West in which respondents felt that had happened. And there's also a fair number of responses in which people said that there's really no noticeable effect of the involvement of non-agency stakeholders. So in the BLM, the East Side Township project, the agency worked very closely with a local nonprofit, and that really served as the interface between the agency and the rest of the community. And this was an instance where the capacity had likely built up the scale, but there's also a moderating factor by an environmental group that was identified as possibly decreasing the scale. So there's those 2, factors at play there that were discussed in the interviews. And also funding appears to be a major factor as well. As folks probably know, the BLM budget has taken a hit in the past several years, and they've been doing less stewardship. So sometimes there's disagreement about whether or not the scale has been influenced. In the Huckleberry project, for instance, the BLM suggested that the tribe had influenced the scale of the project, but the tribe indicated that they had not influenced the scale. So this is just it depends on where you're standing and how you're viewing these projects. And another instance of the BLM, the North Park project, this was an instance where the county respondent said yes, the project had been actually affected by our participation, but they didn't want to say how. So there's sometimes respondents, this is personal experience, personal information, so they may be a little less forthcoming. So theme 5, there's a change in participants from the early days of stewardship contracting. And I talked about this on the Eastern webinar as well. A lot of the early projects, particularly the ones in the West, were very much community-driven projects. You had lots of individuals participating. The trend that we've observed is that there may still be individuals, but by and large, they don't come up when you ask someone to identify the non-agency stakeholders. And if they do, it's usually because of an organization they work for, or a group or a club that they're a member of. So you can see across the 15 Forest Service projects across the country, mostly this is about collaboration with state agencies and environmental groups, collaborative groups, and then a series of other implementers and interested stakeholders, at least in the projects that we looked at. So the 6th theme, agency and non-agency participants in stewardship contracting projects that we looked at do not always see relationships and relationship changes the same way. Agency people tend to be more positive about their relationships. In the Babien project, agency representative actively acknowledged that there's a problem and that their non-agency counterparts were unhappy. And non-agency people who self-identified participated in the project consisted of only providing comments. They didn't feel very involved and they weren't really happy with the outcome. But they were still willing to work on the project. There were some individuals that were really unhappy about the project, but that was for more personal reasons. For instance, the boundary of the project area was right adjacent to their private property. So this is a fairly complex project in terms of the relationships, and it's been going on for a long, long time. And again, there's a couple Forest Service projects that had collaborative groups where expectations were built up. When those expectations weren't met for various reasons, trust suffered, and the projects tended to suffer as a whole. And just another point was the Mill Creek project. This was it's a very interesting project with a long-standing collaborative group. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of how that collaborative group functioned early on. As it's taken on more of an innovative role in terms of how the project is moving forward with the NEPA contracting specifically. I mean, the project was contracted out to a company that is doing NEPA, and because of the high level of scrutiny and legal liability of doing that, there's had to be created a pretty firm wall between the people doing the NEPA work and the people doing the implementation. And that's had some strain that we observed on the collaborative process as a whole, because people felt like they didn't understand what was going on with the project. So last theme, there's a need for flexibility in the agency to accommodate different projects with different stakeholders and different needs. The Mill Creek project is a great example of a very innovative approach, and the agency has really had to step up the flexibility to try that approach. And on the flip side, their collaborators have also had to be more flexible as something new and innovative, which is all in the name of trying to get to a larger scale and increase the pace of restoration in the area, which the collaborative group agrees on. But it's had its challenges and opportunities. So there's a couple projects in which the flexibility of the BLM, for instance, the particular agency people involved really made the project work. So we're going to move on to a facilitated discussion period. There's some polls here, and of the themes that we talked about, the 7 themes, what's the relevance to you in particular, based on your experience with stewardship contracting, your experience working with people other than yourself, whether it's someone in an agency, someone in a collaborative group. Want to get a sense for which of these are most important, and then we're going to talk about them. So also be thinking of these themes and maybe some examples from your own life or some questions that we'd like to ask you to bring those up in the next screen when we discuss this. Okay, so as you guys work through and you can see the results, for the most part, it's looking like all of these themes are relevant to your work to some degree. Particularly the issue with collaboration. Just because you have a collaborative group doesn't mean that it works. And I think that's an interesting theme, and one of the reasons why it came up is this was a question that the Forest Service and BLM specifically wanted us to address. How are collaborative processes and collaborative groups affecting stewardship contracting, and what's the difference between groups or projects that have a collaborative and those that don't? Agencies and non-agency stakeholders, the difference between how they approach and view relationships, that's another one that seems to be pretty relevant for people. Up there at 67, 68%. And then the first one, again, the need for flexibility within agency folks. I mean, that's one that was actually in the Eastern webinar. Also, pretty high up and top priority because there was no collaborative projects that we looked at in the East in terms of having a collaborative group present. That was actually the need for flexibility. That was the #1 priority for the Eastern people in that webinar. So given these results, let's talk about this collaboration process some more. Maybe some people want to provide an example of things that have worked or not worked with collaboration. Maybe there's some venting that needs to go on that I'm sensing. Let's talk about these themes and get a sense for how they resonate with your daily lives. And again, if you're a non-agency person that you're new to stewardship contracting, if you're a non-agency person and you're new to stewardship contracting and you would like to get more involved, this is your opportunity to say, this is how I'd like to be involved, and I'm working in this part of the country on this national forest, this BLM district. How can I get more involved? So again, on the last screen, we saw that the need for flexibility was really important. Maybe an agency person wants to reflect on a time where they had to be responsive to multiple demands and stakeholders. And, it's challenging work, and what we've observed in these case studies and the surveys over the past several years is the agency people that are people and want to work with others tend to be able to weather some of those challenges better than those that don't possess that sort of innate personal characteristic. So we've got a few people typing in here. And just a note, Alex, maybe you want to type in as well and just send a link for our stewardship monitoring reports. There it is. And we will eventually be posting these case studies to that web link, and we're also going to be sending out an email with follow-up information based on this virtual meeting, probably in the next week or so. So, Mark Phillip, interesting comment related to the term social capacity. People's willingness and ability to truly collaborate based on personalities and agendas. Be interested to hear more about those experiences, Mark. Ed Lindahall, collaborative groups and local governments should get more agency accountability of retained receipts and express receipts, as well as more flexibility in spending receipts. This is something that has come up in a few instances. How are we tracking outcomes based on the expenditure of receipts? The use of retained receipts really varies, as I'm sure you all know, across the West based on the type of forest management occurring. If you have if there's commercial value in your timber, and there is a social agreement around harvests, then there's receipts. So there's, Nadia, interesting and provocative question. Is there a need to formally designate a collaborative process or collaborative group? So, I think there's a few examples we can all point to, such as CFLR in policy now, where collaboration is mandated. The Forest Service Handbook for Stewardship Contracting has some description around collaboration and collaborative groups. I would say the West is a really interesting place right now in terms of collaboration around stewardship projects. There's just a lot going on, a lot of examples, and a lot of debate around how we move from collaborative planning into collaborative implementation, and what are the benefits of doing that, if any. And oftentimes that's coming from people that are involved in collaborative processes and struggling to find those points of agreement. So, question from Mark: if we saw a difference between lack of desire to collaborate and lack of ability to or capacity to collaborate, I think that is a really interesting question, given the 5 projects that had collaborative groups. a lot of it depends on the nature of who's involved, how they're interacting, what the track record is as far as their personal relationships and trust. And um, there's no archetype out there. So it's certainly there were instances where individuals had their agendas that they brought to the table, and it was difficult to move off from those points of expectations and find a mediating or middle ground. There was also lots of instances where the group, and this was, I'll use Mill Creek A to Z project as an example, that Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition, one of the respondents had described it as two individuals in the group acting as sort of opposite poles, playing off of each other, that they could actively debate these issues and find that common ground. Good point from Maureen here about the need for people that don't have a background in collaboration, and maybe they don't have a leader who has that innate skill or has developed that within themselves, even though they may have it. So this capacity building question has come up in the monitoring program over the past several years, and one of the recommendations has consistently been invest in collaboration, invest in this innate, the ability of Forest Service and non-agency people to work together. There's a few examples of that where the Forest Service, for instance, is doing that in the Pacific Northwest in partnership with National Forest Foundation. Another good comment here, so a string of comments from Mark describing his experience with groups along the Columbia River, about the maturation of collaborative groups and how they work together. We're getting close to the hour here, so I think we're going to wrap this up soon, but let's just, if people want to keep going for a couple more minutes, this is some good stuff. So let's see what else comes up. Good point by Rachel as well. The communication of all the various, policy requirements, regulatory requirements as a federal land management agency that the agencies have to comply with to the letter of the law. Communicating that to individuals that aren't from that world, that's a real challenge. And for some agency people, it's not a challenge that they signed up for when they started working for the agency. But it's an essential challenge and job duty. So, that's definitely one I can see where it would get tricky. So Sarah raised a good point, a good question for agency people, if anyone wants to respond to that. With all the emphasis on collaboration, are people now having second opinions or second thoughts before investing in it, given some of the challenges and projects that they've seen? Bruce raises an interesting point as well. We did have several examples where the industry collaborators in a few of these collaborative projects, they would prefer a timber sale rather than a stewardship contracting project, but they were still at the table and they were still working with non-agency collaborators. So, I think again, everyone comes into these projects with expectations and desires, and it's interesting when you get into the case studies to see how things have sorted out. We'll get a couple more minutes because I think people are still. This is a great conversation, and then we'll have to sign off. We got two more people, two more comments, and then I think we're going to close it down because sounds like people are signing off. So Rachel, collaboration is a requirement these days, whether we call it or not. We need to actively talk to other people, whether or not we are happy with what they tell us. And Ed Lindahall, perhaps the regulatory environment needs to change. Maybe there's a major change needed, maybe more flexibility. So these are all points that come up in these case studies and these conversations. Wade with the BLM, I appreciate Sarah's comment about cost. The big picture is that we have lots of forest with treatment needs, and the cost is always important. So again, that's where collaboration, there's this tool that's very flexible with goods for services, retained receipts, and if the trust is there and the opportunity is there to look at how you use that tool in an appropriate manner, that seems to be where collaboration has been very beneficial for some projects.